This computer. Okay, so we are on page 231, I believe. We're discussing in this chapter the seven responses to someone who asks God for collateral. So, in other words, to say to God, God, if you want me to serve you, first, give me some front some money, as they say, front some of my blessings, and then I can trust, and then I can serve you. So, um, so he explained a whole bunch of reasons why this is something which is um, not wise at all. Um, and among them, he said that a pledge will never be enough because a person will never know what they need. So we never know what we're going to need in life, right? Because life changes all the time. So to ask God to give you a pledge, well, how much of a pledge? And whatever God gives you, you won't be satisfied with because you're going to say you need more. Secondly, asking God for a collateral is ridiculous because we owe God more than God owes us. So if we consider and we become aware of, which is not so easy for us to do, to be aware of how much God gives us constantly, then we would realize that God should be asking us for a collateral. If anything, we shouldn't be asking God for a collateral. We are way over our heads in what we are indebted to God for. Another explanation he gave is that um, the only reason to take collateral is for he listed one of three reasons, which are all reasons of concern that the person will lose their money, they'll decide that they don't want to pay you back because they can get away with it, whatever it may be. But all of these reasons don't apply to God because God will never run out of money or resources or whatever it may be. And God is good. God's not going to pull a fast one on you, etc. So therefore, there's no reason to ask God to front money. The only reason, by the way, of course, is because we don't trust. In other words, we live in fear of what's going to be, and we always want to have security, and we haven't trained ourselves yet to have security in the only secure place that there is in this world, which is God, which would mean I don't need anything for tomorrow today. I just need God, and I have God. And another reason he explained was that the collateral doesn't guarantee peace. Why? Because even if God were to give us a collateral, what would God give us? So God says, okay, I'm going to give you, I'll deposit $10 million into your bank account. Oh, now I'm secure, right? Is that guaranteed, right? Uh, the bank collapses. We're left with only a quarter of a million of the 10 million, right? Many things can happen, and whatever security God gives us doesn't have to necessarily be there. Maybe it's going to make us feel secure because we have something physical and tangible. But the security really is that God is ensuring that we have what we need. So all of these are reasons why we it's critical that we develop trust in God. And as I have said many times, the strongest human being is a human being who doesn't need to have something now because they know that God is with them and is taking care of them. That's extremely powerful. So now we're up to page 231 on the bottom of the page where it says, the sixth response to such a person who insists on having a collateral security, physical security, we'll say. Um, to such a person is as follows. We're the person who is taking the security pledge from his friend, sure that his friend will repay his debt before its due date. Let's say I'm taking a security pledge from you. I lent you $10,000 and you give me a collateral, something to hold on to. And I am sure that you will repay this debt before its due date. Number one, you're going to give it back to me before we even agreed upon. And you're going to pay me double the amount because you're going to be so grateful for the favor I did of lending you the money. And he would pay him double the amount that he owes him in return for his waiting as a kindness toward him. Then he would certainly never take the security pledge from him. If I really was absolutely sure that you are going to pay me back and not only pay me back early, and you're going to pay me back double because of your gratitude towards my helping you, would I take a security pledge? Of course I wouldn't, right? There would be no reason to take a security pledge. So, and here, now, of course, a human being can never guarantee that, but we're just saying that as a way of creating a context here in regards to God. And here we are speaking of the Creator, may he be blessed. We know of his good conduct with us and his abundant kindness to us. Hopefully we know, right? Like I always say, that we woke up. Who knows how many mornings have you woken up? And how many breaths have you taken in your life, right? Both recently as well as in the past. And that he repays us for our acts of charity and service with a reward that cannot be grasped by human intellect and certainly cannot be articulated. And the blessings that God gives us sometimes are a blessing which is far beyond what we can even articulate, which is a little bit of a conversation in and of itself, which we're going to have in a moment about blessings which are beyond what we can comprehend. A verse is quoted as a source that the reward in the world to come, that's what he's referring to here as a reward that we can't even articulate or grasp, is indescribable and beyond human intellect. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah writes, no eye had ever seen God besides yours, what is prepared for him who waits for you. Only you, God, have seen what you prepared as reward for people who await you. It means that people who who follow in your way and they trust in you. Since God's kindness to us is unlimited, it is even more of a great disgrace if we were to take a security pledge from him. So what he's saying is like this, which is really a challenge, an enormous, enormous challenge, and that is to appreciate the reward that God has for a soul when that soul lives to its purpose. And when I say lives to its purpose, I don't mean fully even. I just mean every single act a person does that's in alignment with their purpose, the reward is enormous. Now, what is this reward that we can't understand? So I think we've had this conversation in the past, and it's basically, trying to an analogy which is not a perfect analogy, but somewhat of an analogy. A person trying to explain to their son, right, why or daughter, whatever, their child, why they should take the gift of $1,000 for their birthday versus the big toy that's $75, right? And the child just doesn't have the ability to understand the value of money. They're 3 years old. They see a nice big toy, right? That looks exciting, and there's really no way that you can get a 3-year-old typically to really understand the value of the $1,000 that you can put into a bank and invest, and you'll able to buy 10,000 toys with it, whatever it may be, right? The child doesn't have that comprehension. And in the very same way, a human being does not have the ability to comprehend spiritual bliss, spiritual pleasure. So we're not talking about anything beyond pleasure, actually. The interesting thing is, I'm going to get a little bit sidetracked to spiritual here, but the interesting thing is that the deepest part of the human soul is associated with pleasure. And the deepest experience of a human being is an experience of pleasure. I'm going to explain that a little bit, and then I'm going to explain how that can be, because that may sound contradictory to what you would think. What pleasure? I mean, we indulgent people. We're hedonists. We just believe in enjoying ourselves. What pleasure? What are we talking about? So I want to explain all of this. But the first thing I want to explain is that when a person has an experience of pleasure, it's not a logical experience. It's a very, maybe we can call it visceral or experience that is true to a very deep part of the person. That's why it's at certain types of pleasure, a person loses all, forgets about everything and anything that's going on around them, because the pleasure can be such a deep, intense expression of who the person is. So pleasure actually is a very, very deep thing. We often think of it as a very shallow thing because the types of pleasure that we indulge in are often very shallow. And that's what I wanted to create a distinction about here, and that is that there are two types of pleasure. There is the pleasure of the animal soul, which is the pleasure of self-indulgence, right? Which actually is very unsatisfying out once the because it is very short-lived. Any form of self-indulgent pleasure or animal soul pleasure or physical pleasure is very short-lived. And then it usually, like many unhealthy things, it gives us a high and then we crash. So that's pretty much what happens. If you think about any a raw physical pleasure, that's what it is. However, whenever we have a spiritual pleasure, that means a genuine experience which is aligned with our divine soul. It's something which is good and holy. It's not self-oriented. That is a very, very deep experience. So, for example, if you think of a time, I don't know what would, there are different things that might resonate with you. One would be the experience of something which is very real. When you experience something a very real moment, you wouldn't even describe it as a pleasurable moment necessarily. Like for example, you're at a family, your family's together, or there's some event like a celebration of a wedding. It could be even a funeral, and at this event you have a moment of experience of something very raw and real. And you can be laughing, you can be crying. It could be either of the two, but there is a certain experience of realness that creates a deep pleasure that often people may not describe as a pleasure, but is actually a pleasure, a satisfaction that the person has of experiencing that, and they can, and very often they will come back to that experience many times, even by just going back to it in their mind and then experiencing it again, because it's not something which just peaks and crashes. It's something that is real, so therefore it's sustainable. That would be one type of type of a divine pleasure, and such pleasure it comes from a very deep level of one's soul, which is the reason why it's not an intellectual experience, because an intellectual experience is not from the depths of one's soul. An intellectual experience is actually a much more external in relation to the essence of one's soul. Likewise, emotions are external to the essence of one's soul. So pleasure, which we call in Hebrew tainug, is is much deeper than an emotional experience or an intellectual experience. That's why I'm referring to it maybe as a visceral experience, as just a deep, real trueness that a person experiences. And it's very hard for us to relate to what I just said. I explained it, but we probably have experiences that you are relating to. Now let's take that to where God says your soul, when it is free from the inhibitions and the limitations and the constraints of your body, what it can experience is so deep and so powerful and so blissful that it's beyond what we can even comprehend. So I'm talking about something that I don't comprehend and I have not experienced because I'm living in a body. But that is what God gives to us. That's what he's saying. And that's the great kindness of God, that for when we do things that are in alignment with our purpose of what he put us in this world for, and the more we do that, the more we have that, the soul has that experience when it goes to the world of truth. And so we're going to ask God for a collateral when God gives us such unbelievable reward for what we do. That's the point that he's making here. If you look on the bottom of the page, where it says we know of God's good conduct with us and his abundant kindness to us, both recently as well as in the past. So the Zohar teaches that when a person goes to sleep, he's depositing his soul with God for safekeeping. I don't know if you ever thought of it that way, but that's what's happening. We actually deposit our soul with God. That's why the soul gets rejuvenated, because it, in a certain respect, gets is deposited to God. What is it? Let me also explain this a little bit. When a person is sleeping, we would I think we would all agree that the person's in a minor state of unconsciousness. Unconsciousness means that the soul is not very conscious of the self, right? Which is why the body is like asleep. right? Which gives the soul the ability to be conscious of more elevated and higher things. And that is being in the deposited with God in the safekeeping of God. And although the person is in debt to God more, more than the value of his soul, God nevertheless returns a vibrant soul to him and does not keep it as collateral. God doesn't hold on to it and say, hey, you haven't been living up to your purpose very well. I'm going to hold on to this soul for collateral. That's essentially what we call death, the soul not coming back into the body. But this is the reason why it's very important that everyone says, and the reason why Jews say in the morning, the very first thing we do when we wake up in the morning, before we even wash our hands as we're meant to from spiritual impurities, right when we open up our eyes in our bed, we say a one-line passage. And there's something very powerful about this passage. I mean, there are a number of things, but I want to point out one of them. We say, Moda ani lefanecha, I am thankful to you, before you, Melech Chai V'Chaim, the eternal and living God, Shechazar to be nishmatzi, that you have restored to me my soul, bechemla, with compassion. And then we say two last words, Rabba emunasecha, how abundant is your faithfulness. Now, what that means is that we are telling God, God, you are so faithful. That means you are so faithful that no matter what and how I live my days, day after day after day, you faithfully give me life again and again and again. God restores life to me, gives my soul back to me, gives my soul back to me. In other words, when people are sometimes upset at God, that it's so out of context of reality once we are in touch with reality. What is the reality? The reality is that God gives us life every single day and really every single moment, but it's very strongly experienced in the morning when we wake up from this unconsciousness to a state of consciousness where our soul is vibrant again and rejuvenated and rested, right? And knowing that there's much that God has asked of me that I may not have fulfilled. So then why is God restoring? God says, I have faith. I have faith that you're going to get there and you're slowly going to, increase and get more and more aligned with your purpose. That's very, very powerful. To me, it's very powerful. And so that's what he's saying here. So every morning, immediately upon waking up, we praise God by saying the Modani prayer, in which we say, "Thank you, God, for returning to me my soul, and not withholding it from me due to my debt to you. How great is your faithfulness!" In fact, this behavior is also a Jewish law. If one gives his friend a deposit for safekeeping, the friend cannot withhold it as payment for a loan that the depositor owes him. That sounds strange. What's the whole purpose of taking a deposit? A person can argue that, rationally speaking, a person who owes another person money and now places an item in that person's possession for safekeeping, this latter person has the full right to withhold it in lieu of payment. Nevertheless, the relationship that a Jew has with God is not based on intellect alone. It is super rational, and the Jew conducts his life according to the edicts of the Torah, even if they seem to defy logic. We fulfill them because it is the will of God. This attitude of serving God without any calculation comes from an essential connection between a Jew's soul and God, where the will of God is more important than the limitations of a person's understanding. So even when we're in a situation where it's not rational, it doesn't seem to compute to me. God, you asked me to do this, but it contradicts my abilities. How can I do this? The Jew still does it because of our inherent connection to God, and things work out because God makes them work out. Let's go to the next page. Page 233. We're good, everyone? I'm assuming. Okay. The seventh response to such a person who wants to take a collateral from God. A person who takes a security pledge from his friend only takes the pledge if he is able to supply his friend with merchandise that corresponds to the value of the security pledge. When we're taking a security pledge from a friend, we're taking it because we are giving them a certain value, $10,000. So we take a security pledge worth $10,000. But were we only to give them a $5,000, would we take a pledge that's worth $10,000? Of course not. So, however, a person who takes a security pledge from the Creator, may he be blessed, by requesting God's kindness in advance of fulfilling his obligations towards him, does not have the capability to repay with his service of God, because he is not even assured that he will be able to repay his old debts. All the more so that he can't be sure that he'll be able to pay back the new debts. One should be terrified of taking a collateral from God. Why? You may never be able to pay it back. For even a righteous man would not be able to repay God for the good that God has bestowed upon him, were it not for God's helping him. Because God gives us so abundantly that we wouldn't be able to even pay God back for what God gives us. An average person might not be able to repay God for his kindness. Furthermore, even a righteous person needs help from God to serve him. This being the case, it makes no sense for a person to request God's kindness in advance, because it is unlikely that he'll be capable of repaying him. In other words, if the way you know that you're becoming more honest with what God does for you is when you begin to realize that you'll never be able to pay back God for all he has done for you. That's when you begin to realize that. Until then, we are not are looking accurately at what God gives us, and that's very, very often the case. Is that we have more complaints against God than gratitude towards God, and that's primarily because we are not in touch with the truth of how much God gives us. And that's because we take it for granted. And we take it for granted because God just gives it to us faithfully, 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 right? So that creates a very big handicap, which we have to overcome. Page 234. As one of the pious men said in his praises of God, even the intellectual who knows you does not glory in his actions. Rather, he praises your name and your mercy because you prepared his heart so that it is able to know you. For through you and your help, all the children of Israel will be found to be righteous and praised, saying, we have glorified in God all day long, and we will forever praise your name. In other words, even the righteous need God's help to be righteous and know him. All the more so does an average person need God's help to fulfill the mitzvah. Okay, let's do the summary. There are 7 responses to a person who has the attitude that he will first ensure that he has his material needs, and only then will he take care of his service of God. So again, this chapter was a chapter of 7 reasons why a person should not approach the service of God by saying, God, when I have everything I need and I'm secure, then I will serve you. And as I encourage through this chapter, that you find where in your life you're doing that. I was just speaking with someone, and he said he cannot imagine closing his business on Shabbos. And I told him, you probably can't imagine it. But why don't you just do it? Because the only way to begin to imagine it is by doing it and seeing what God will do. And then you'll be able to imagine that you can make even more money with your business closed on Shabbos than you think you can only make with it open on Shabbos. In other words, sometimes we have to bring out the greatness from within ourselves by getting ourselves to act with trust, even though we're petrified inside. And then we begin to see the results of trust, and we say, wow. But sometimes the only way you can experience that is if you actually do it. Similar to, as I've shared, similar to me trying to explain to you how delicious a certain food is. I can talk to you about it for a full day, but the only way you're going to really know how delicious the food is if you eat the food. You have to eat the food, right? Talking about it doesn't help. Philosophy doesn't help. It's an experience. And that's why there are many parts of Judaism that cannot be appreciated until one actually does it. So you say, it doesn't make sense. Why? Yeah. Okay, no problem. Just do it. Just do it anyway. Do it anyway, even though it doesn't make any sense. And let me know what you experience. That's much of Judaism is experienced that way. So, number one, it only makes sense to take a security pledge from someone who has no control over you. Someone that doesn't have any control over you, then you need a security pledge from them. But someone who has full control over you, you don't need a security pledge. They're in control. Number two, it only makes sense to take a security pledge that is of limited value. Um, and you're never going to know. This was the idea that you'll never know how much you're going to need. Number three, it makes no sense to take a security pledge from someone to whom you owe money. We owe God far more than God owes us. So it doesn't even make sense for God to front, to so to speak, give us collateral. Number four, it only makes sense to take a security pledge from other humans who are limited in their capabilities. But God has no limitations. So being that God has no limitations, there's no reason to take a security pledge. God is all able, and nothing can limit God at any point. Number five, the objective of a security pledge is peace of mind. However, in this case, amassing wealth does not do that because he may lose the money. Alternatively, the wealth may be the cause of his stress. There are two things he's saying. Number one is there is nothing physical that can give someone security because this physical world is inherently insecure. And we rely, all of our security we put into physical things. It's inherently insecure. And secondly, very often the material things themselves are what give us stress. Because then we begin worrying about how am I going to make sure that I don't lose the $20 million that God has given me. You would think if someone is very wealthy, then they are automatically more generous. That is not the case at all. Why is that not the case? That's not the case because it has all to do with trust. Generosity has to do with trust. A little bit of nature. Certain people are naturally more generous, but ultimately, like in the big generosity, has to do with trust. If I trust in God, then so if someone is naturally generous, right? So they will be generous to the point that they're comfortable. If someone is generous because they have trust in God, they will be generous to the point that God tells them to be generous, which is a minimum of 10% of their income, and from there it can grow significantly. That the person can give more and more and more to the extent that they choose to. Um, Number six, since God's kindness is unlimited, it makes no sense to take a security pledge from him. God's kindness is unlimited. So if God's kindness is unlimited, if God's infinitely kind, you take security pledge from someone who's infinitely kind, there's no point in doing that. And number seven, a person can only repay his responsibilities toward God with his help. The only way I can give back to God is if God helps me and gives me resources to give back to him. As such, it makes no sense to take a security pledge from God, who's the one who's giving me what I'm going to give back to him. No, it's sort of like it's sort of like what's it like? Sometimes my wife, my wife and I joke around when we buy a birthday present, that she used my credit card uh, to buy me my present, or I used her credit card to buy her present, right? It's like we use, but we thank God have a shared account, so it's all the same pool, right? But that's sort of like God's giving me everything I have to give back to God. So I'm going to ask God to give me collateral. The whole thing's just preposterous. As such, it makes no sense to take a security pledge from God when He might not be able to repay God when He already owes. Okay. Any questions before we start chapter 7? We don't have anything in the chat, right? We're good. Okay. Okay, wow, fantastic. Okay. We are in our home stretch, everyone. We have I think about 12 pages left. And then if anyone has any specific interests that we should pick up on after we conclude Gate of Trust, that's along these lines of some general way, you can let me know. But I'm also entertaining different ideas, and we'll come up with a fantastic text to continue working with once we finish Gate of Trust. So, page 238. In this chapter, the author will list a number of impediments to a person's bitachon. What are the challenges, the what are the words called? The hang-ups, the obstacles that come in one's way of having bitachon. This would be very helpful to know. We could take them on and challenge them. He will then continue by saying that um, a person's level of bitachon will be in accordance with his understanding of God. He's got a very important point that the extent to which you can trust in God is going to be directly correlated to your understanding of God, which is fascinating. And that's the reason why the study of Hasidic philosophy is very critical, because the study of Hasidic philosophy is the study of God, actually. And lastly, he will illustrate this by discussing various levels of bitachon. He's also going to give us different levels of bitachon that exist. So avoid interference. In general, it's a good policy. If you're an avid football fan, you know that when there's an interference of some sort, which in football would be called an interception, that's a real big setback. As some of you, if you're an avid football fan, you know from last night. So that is what we're talking about, interference, right? Interference is a very big problem. We don't want anything to interfere with our trust in God. Having completed explaining in this gate that which is fitting to explain regarding the matters of bitachon, according to our understanding, it is now appropriate to explain which matters are an impediment and interference to a person's trust in God. I will say that those matters that are impediments to achieving the levels explained in the three previous gates are all impediments to a person's trust in God as well. Okay, here's what he's saying. This book called Gate of Trust, actually is not a book. It's a chapter. This whole book is really one chapter in a book called Duties of the Heart. So Rabbi Yehuda ibn Pekuda wrote a book called Duties of the Heart, which all have to do with heart matters. What is heart matters? Loving God, fearing God, right? All of these things are ideas, are mitzvot, commandments that God commands us, which are heart matters, right? There's no action of loving God and fearing God. I mean, there are many things we can do with love of God and fear of God, but it's a matter of living in an emotional state. And so the whole book of Duties of the Heart is all about these types of obligations that we have. And one of them is trusting in God. So that's one chapter. So he says, you want to know what the impediments are? Well, firstly, all of the impediments to the previous three chapters, which he calls gates, which is why this book is called Gate of Trust, because it's one chapter called the Gate of Trust. So the impediments to what I discussed in the three previous chapters are the same impediments for trusting in God. So let's go to at the bottom of the page for a second, the three previous gates. So there's the gate of unity. What's the gate of unity? That's a chapter that discusses how all that God is one, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And what does that mean that God is one? Really, what it means is that all there is one, and that's God. There's nothing else that exists. Now that sounds like a very radical statement. What do you mean? I exist. What do you mean there's nothing else that exists? But when we realize that all of existence is dependent on God, because originally all there was God, and then God created, so everything is dependent on God, then we know that we don't have absolute existence, we have dependent existence. Because we depend on what brought us into being. This is a little bit philosophical, but I'm just going to leave it at that for now. So that's the gate of unity. There's the gate of reflection. There's the gate of service of God. All different aspects of relating to God. And the final chapters of each of these three gates discuss the factors that are impediments to a full embrace of the message of that particular gate. All these are also impediments to trust in God. What are they? So if you look on the next paragraph in the commentary, among these impediments are serving God with ulterior motives. This is a big one, huge one. Why are we serving God? Right? So when we serve God with an ulterior motive, what does that mean, an ulterior motive? It means we're not serving God for God. Right? We're serving God because of some benefit that I have. That is a huge impediment to trusting in God. Why? Because we're not trusting in God. We're trying to get something out of God. I want to explain it this way. You know, whenever you have an interaction with someone where you have an unspoken agenda to get something from them, which sometimes is so unspoken that you yourself don't even realize that you have this agenda, and were someone to point it out to you, you would deny it. That happens a lot, by the way. Um, and that's unfortunately a level of dishonesty that we have with ourselves. It's very valuable to become more and more clear about why we are, why are we having this conversation with this person? Why are we interacting with them? What is our real agenda? Like, what do we really want? And to be just straight up about it, to be straight about it. So, very often, and this is why I've pointed out numerous times as we were going through this book, because people do this a lot when it comes to trusting in God, that their whole trust in God is what? Because I heard that if you trust in God, then God gives you what you're trusting for. So therefore, I'm trusting in God so I can get what I want, which weakens the trust because it lacks authenticity. The true trusting in God would be that while that concept is true, I trust in God that God, you'll provide good for me, whatever it may be, without any particular agenda that I'm showing up with, which requires a development of integrity within ourselves. You can't show up one day with that. You have to slowly, slowly revisit my lack of integrity, and I'm showing up with an agenda. God, I'm yours. I'm here I'm serving you not to get something in return. I'm serving you because that's why I was put in this world, to serve you, so I'm serving you. You know how sometimes, for example, there's a Mishnah that teaches in the Ethics of Our Fathers that there are two types of love. There's a ava hatluya b'davar. There's a love which is dependent on something, and a ava she'eina tluya b'davar, and a love that is independent of anything. What does that mean? That means that if I have a friend that I love this friend, and then something happens, the person does something that wasn't nice to me, right? And my friendship sort of falls out with them. That means that my entire friendship with them until that point was a love hatluya b'davar that was dependent on something. What was it dependent on? It was dependent on the way this person behaves. We call that conditional love. Whereas when I could put into context why this person did it, and then I'm still going to stand by them to support them and help them, and hopefully they won't do it again, right? Without making myself like vulnerable. I don't have to make myself vulnerable to them hurting me again, right? But I'm committed to them, right? That is a love which is unconditional. That is really, we'll say, definitely at least as a start, what we would like to demonstrate to our children. Additionally, I should say, not even more, but additionally also, that would be a very powerful love to demonstrate to your spouse, if you have a spouse, or to it could be to friends. That's the real deal. That's someone who's the real deal. Now, so there's a lot to learn about how to do that. It's a big art, right? But that's powerful. That's how marriages don't fall apart, because we committed ourselves to be married, and I'm going to deal with everything that you are dealing with. Then hopefully they're going to deal with everything I'm dealing with. And it's unconditional. It's not conditional upon that it's working for me or it's not too hard, right? So serving God without ulterior motives means that I'm here in this world to serve God. God, what do you want from me? I spend time learning what that is, and I do it. And even though life is not always kind, in my experience, I'm still committed to God. Um, the very fact that one may be serving God with an ulterior motive means that I'm not trusting God, right? I'm playing a game with God to get something. And we all know how that feels when people do that with us. Yeah. Then you have a second reason, pursuit of materialistic desires, which, by the way, this is the biggest ulterior motive. The biggest ulterior motive is it's some material desire that we have. We have a certain desire, leaving a person with no time or peace of mind for contemplation. Because when a person has materialistic desires, they're not going to be able to contemplate and develop this very powerful trust in God, because they're consumed in their material desires. You know how you may have experienced how, like, maybe a friend or someone, they're preoccupied, like you can't get their attention. They're preoccupied with whatever they're preoccupied with. There's something on their mind. So likewise, when someone is consumed in material desires, they're preoccupied. So to be occupied with the purpose they were put in this world for is in conflict with one second, God, I'm busy with my own stuff right now. And another one is becoming so accustomed to God's kindness that a person neglects his obligation to repay God by serving him. That very often we take for granted all of the kindness that God gives us, which I would say we're all quite guilty of, because it's so easy to take it for granted, because it's not as if God is a person who's showing up and giving it to us, right? When someone shows up and gives you a gift, it's very blatant and clear. You acknowledge that. But when you just are given it over and over and over every single moment, without any obvious appearance of anything, then it's very easy for one to forget. And number four, lack of belief that the troubles that befall a person are really for his benefit, resulting in ingratitude toward God. Okay, this is a huge one. Realizing that God only does good is essentially what he's saying here. Everything God does to you, God is doing for you. It's all for your benefit. What do you mean? This is miserable. It's a terrible thing that happened, right? It's for your benefit. Now, it may not be the benefit that you're thinking of, like and I don't. This should never happen. We always ask God for a revealed good. But I'm going to use this as an example, just so that we can have an example of what he's saying here. Even though we still ask from God to always give us revealed good, that we should never have any challenges, or troubles, right? But sometimes, I always see any type of challenging relationship that God gives me as a huge benefit to me to be able to cultivate better character. And I also know, as God surely knows, far better than even I know, that I will never cultivate that character without having the challenge of this relationship. Because unless I'm forced to, I will never develop that. So that's a way of seeing, right? Of realizing that there are things in my life which are maybe unpleasant or not ideal or not the way I would want them to be, but I know that they're for my benefit. And this is actually true for anything in our lives, which is, which is a challenge for us. That it's really purely for our benefit. We could use many examples, and I'm just going to leave it at that. And then number five, sense of entitlement, where the person thinks he's owed God's kindness. Then there's a sense of entitlement, which is really arrogance. A person just is arrogant, and they don't see themselves in context, and therefore they think that they're owed things because for whatever reasons. All of these are what he's mentioned in his previous chapters or previous gates as impediments to a person's trust in God. And now he adds a few more impediments on top of the page. Other impediments to a person's trust in God are as follows. Number one, foolishness that people have regarding the greatness of the Creator and his positive attributes, in which he conducts himself with his creations. For such a person who does not comprehend the Creator's compassion for his creations, his conduct with them, his supervision and rulership over them, and that they are utterly connected to him, will not be able to have peace of mind or rely on him. He's saying some major statements here. He's saying that God has compassion for all of his creations, and that God supervises and rules over all of his creations. That means God's constantly aware of all of his creations, and that they're utterly connected to him, that we are in constant, direct contact with God. There is never a single moment that God loses sight of us or forgets us. And if a person is not aware of this, then the person will not have full trust in God. A person who does not comprehend the God's greatness and capabilities cannot have proper trust in him, because you don't believe, right? Such a person doesn't believe that God even knows what's going on in my life. Never mind that he cares and he has compassion. In order for one to trust in God, there are certain beliefs that have to be in place. One of them is that God is omnipotent. Omnipotent means that God is all powerful. That means God could do anything. Anything at any moment. In one moment, the whole world can be saying that Israel has to pull out of Gaza. And in the next moment, you can have the leader of the free world saying that we should let all Gazans leave Gaza, right? Which you wouldn't even fathom, so it would be a consideration. It's like 180 degrees. Without discussing that, just the fact that the world can flip 180 degrees, whether it's for the good or for the bad, because it goes different directions at different times, is only because there's a God who, boom, God wants it differently, and then in a single moment, things happen that just shock everyone and everything. And that's because God is omnipotent. God is all powerful. God can do anything. So one has to believe, in order to trust in God, you have to believe that God is omnipotent. Otherwise, God can't help me. If God's not all powerful, how is he going to help me? But if God is all powerful, God can help me with anything. We can have 100 doctors lined up and all of them say it's impossible. 24 hours, this person will not be living, and this person can live and be fully recovered. Then you have God as being omniscient. That means God is fully aware. Now, in order to trust in God, you have to believe that God is omniscient, God is fully aware, because it could be God's omnipotent, he's all powerful, but if he's not aware, what does his power do for me? He doesn't know that I have a problem. So we must believe that number one, God's omnipotent, number two, God's omniscient. So God's all powerful, God's all aware. So now, the all powerful God that can do anything is aware of my problem. But there's one more issue. God may be all powerful, he could do anything. He is aware of my problem, but maybe he doesn't want to. Maybe he doesn't want to. So that's why there is also, must be the third belief, that God is compassionate. That God's compassion is infinite. That when God knows I have a problem that bothers him, he wants to fix that problem. When we believe these three fundamental beliefs, then we can walk through life with trust in God. And the trust in God itself, as we've learned in the past, is what awakens these divine powers into reality so that they play themselves out, even for a person who's totally undeserving. So imagine this. Imagine you have a Jew, right, who was raised with Judaism. So he knows, right? Most Jews were not raised with Judaism, right? Which could include many of us here, right? So we don't know. We're learning. Beautiful. But if someone knows, right, what God wants from them and why God put them in this earth. And whenever they turned their back, they why they turn their back. For some reason, almost everyone turns their back because we get caught up in the material world and our own selfish pursuits of enjoyment of life or whatever it is we're pursuing. So whatever, right? And then there's a crisis that hits them. And in that crisis, they turn to God and they say, God, I know that you're omnipotent. I know you're all powerful. God, I know you're omniscient. I know you're very much aware of what I'm going through. And God, I know you're compassionate. You have infinite compassion. God, I trust that you are going to take care of this situation for me. And the person has a real calm that comes over them because they really, despite the fact that they're not, engaged in any other way, but in this moment they were able to come to this and they're with God. God says, you're not deserving, but you don't need to be deserving. Why not? Because God says, I don't work with deserving. I'm not a calculated person, right? I have unconditional love. And right now you're showing up so beautifully, and I'm going to show up for you. The trust itself awakens that, which is why he explained earlier in the book that even someone who's undeserving, he emphasized this, even someone who's undeserving, like from a calculated point of view of it's not relevant to God. God's unconditional love. When you have unconditional love, it's unconditional. It's not conditional upon your behavior. So that's very, very, very powerful. And these are all the beliefs one needs to have in order to trust in God. And that's so the foolishness that he's talking about over here, we don't comprehend that God is compassionate. Number two, another impediment, ignorance regarding the commandments of the Creator, may he be blessed. Meaning his Torah, in which he has warned us to rely on him and to trust in him, as it says, and test me now with this. And it says in Isaiah, trust in the Lord forever. Another impediment to trusting God is not trusting in what God tells us. So, by the way, it says over here, Malachi, it says, from the book of Malachi, it says, and test me now with this. What's he referring to? You know that actually, this is the one time that God tells us that we should openly test God. How do you openly test me? He's talking about charity, actually. Giving 10% to charity. Where God says, test me and you will see. This is the one time that God says, test me and you will see that I will give you far more than you give if you give. I'm asking you to give 10% of your income minimum 10% to tzedakah, and you would test me on it. See what I'm going to give you back. You'll see, which is really powerful. And then the general idea that Isaiah writes, Bitchu ba'Hashem, right? Bitchu Hashem adiyad, that we should trust in God eternally. So what does that mean? That means that we have to let go, or as we say, let go and let God, right? Let go and trust in God. Like I said earlier, just do it. Even if you're not feeling it, just do it and see what happens. Another impediment, the propensity to attribute his success to the immediate causes that are apparent. Okay, this is a huge one. This is a huge one. What's he saying? Just actually, before we start this one, because we have limited, I want to go to the commentary on the bottom of page 238 where it says foolishness that people have regarding the greatness of the Creator and his positive attributes. The Lubavitch Rebbe writes, the Rebbe wrote to someone a letter, and he writes, the conclusion of your letter concerning your lack of joy contradicts the beginning of your letter, in which you describe what you have been through. To use your words, by means of miracles, literally, you remained among the surviving refugees and started a family. In other words, this guy survived the war, World War II. So he's saying, by means of miracles, literal miracles, you're a refugee and you have a family. make for yourself a calculation. If God was able to save you from your experience in the past years and enable you to succeed in building a Jewish home on the foundations of the Torah and the mitzvahs, how much more so can God, who provides nourishment and sustenance for all, provide you and your family, you and your family's livelihood? In other words, you're worried about how you're going to make a living. God saved you with miracles. You think He's not going to be able to take care of your living? This depends only on bitachon. God says it depends on one. The Rebbe writes him, it depends on one thing. You want a livelihood? Trust in God that God will give it to you. And fulfillment of the commandment of charity, because for God, perfect trust that He will provide for a person's needs and the needs of his household is effective. How does a person show trust in God that I trust that you will provide me with a livelihood? When I give charity. I'm not worried. How can I give this? Right? I need it. No, God's my provider. I'm not my provider. My bank account's not my provider. Even my boss isn't my provider. God's my provider. This is particularly so when his trust is accompanied by contributing to charity, because God says concerning charity, and test me now with this, that there will be tithe in order that you grow rich. Test me with what? With the mitzvah of tithing, which means giving 10%, so that you will grow rich. God says, when you tithe, God will make you rich. It's a phenomenal idea. Phenomenal concept that contradicts anything anyone's going to tell you. Any financial advisor will tell you. What's the concept? Give your money to a good cause. That's how you're going to make money. No one will ever tell you that. They'll always tell you, save your money to make money, right? Give your money to a good cause. And that's how you're going to make money. May God enable you to give glad tidings concerning all the above. That's how the Rebbe concludes with this gentleman. And let's just do this one last other comment. Ignorance of the Torah is an impediment to bitachon because Torah teaches how to have bitachon. Furthermore, the Torah says, bottom of page 240, that trusting in God, giving charity, and fulfilling the mitzvah are all ways to elicit blessing from God. It's when we live our lives in alignment with God and in alignment with the purpose that God put us here as a Jew, that is when God says, oh, you're a worthy investee, if there's such a word. You're a worthy person for me to invest in. And that's when God invests in us. And so it's counterintuitive. The exact opposite of what we would think is the way. In order for us to be blessed with blessing is the way we get the blessing. And that is not by hoarding, by actually using the blessings God gives us for the purpose that God gives it to us, trusting that God is our supplier and will continue to supply us, and that's when God supplies us with great abundance. Okay, well, we're going to stop here, and we will continue, God willing, next week with number 3.